without further ado, I suppose I'd better introduce the speakers. We have myself. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly. The Bennett was just accidental, but it looks good. I'm a historical non-fiction writer, and I've written several books on the history of medieval women, and my latest book was Defenders of the Norman Crown, Rise and Fall of the Warenne Earls of Surrey. Oh, it's backwards, lovely. So that's me, and we also have Elizabeth Chadwick, who her biography is a bit more longer and more extravagant than mine. She's a New York Times best-selling author of The Greatest Night, which I'm pretty sure is everyone's favourite novel of William Marshall. Her latest book, A Marriage of Lions, will be released in September, I think, Elizabeth?
The 9th, yes.
And is absolutely fantastic. I've had a preview and it's brilliant, and I really like her version of John de Warenne. So it's about Joanna de Muchesny. I can never pronounce her name. Muchesny.
Muchesny.
William Marshall's granddaughter. Next up we have Carol McGrath, who is at this minute in Greece. She's having a few electrical issues because of the forest fires and things and the massive heat out there, but we're hoping she can stay with us for the whole session.
I hope so.
Carol is the author of The Handfasted Wife and the brilliant Mistress Cromwell, which I reviewed a couple of years ago. On this day, apparently, Carol, I saw the review earlier.
Really?
And wow. She has just published The Damask Rose, the second instalment of her She-Wolves trilogy. And The Stone Rose, I think, comes out next year, doesn't it, Carol?
It does. It's with my publisher now. It's with Headline 9.
I can't wait to read that, especially seeing that I was involved. I actually met you on the day you learnt to do the stone carving. So.
Oh, yes, of course. That was great fun. Oh, that was a lovely time. Mm-hmm.
And so we have in England, Elizabeth, in Greece, Carol, North America not wanting to be left out, we have Samantha Wilcoxon, who is author of the Plantagenet Embers series, which started with Plantagenet Princess Tudor Queen about Elizabeth of York, the wife of Henry VII, and is actually still the best book I've ever read on Elizabeth of York. It was from her viewpoint, and I think Samantha really got into Elizabeth's head. Her latest book, Luminous, was set in the 1920s and told the tragic story of the Radium Girls. And she is also currently writing a non-fiction book. And Carol is as well, so I'm getting them converted.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I've said that again, haven't I? If you're happy, ladies, I am happy to start with the questions. So the first one, which is, I don't have to think about this so much, although I do have to work out where I'm going with each project. I just wondered, when writing, which comes first, the research or the story? So can we go to Elizabeth first?
Okay, it's the research that comes first, because otherwise I wouldn't know what to write about, basically. So when doing A Marriage of Lions, I didn't know what I was going to write about next. And then I happened to read Linda Mitchell's superb biography of Joanna de Valence, who turned out to be William Marshall's granddaughter. And I became so interested in the characters that I thought, yes, this person would bear writing about, definitely. And the same as I further researched into it and realized there were issues here that have been totally ignored by historians, such as Joanna's husband, William de Valence. He's never had a biography written of him, and yet biographies of Simon de Montfort, his nemesis, at 10 a penny. Why not? And so this sort of led me on to start writing the story. It's always the same. I read about someone, I become interested in them, and then we start having a conversation. What can you tell me you haven't told anyone before, even if you are really famous? This happened with Eleanor of Aquitaine. And that's how it goes from there. I have to become interested in them, and they have to want to walk with me. And I can only do that by researching first. So that's the basis of the thing.
Brilliant, thank you. Carol, how about you? What comes first?
It's both. the research certainly leads to the story, and it has to be something I'm interested in, whether it's place research, you know, somewhere that you've been that you really feel an affinity for, and or museum, or, you know, source research. For example, I found the Handfasted wife from a visit to the Bayeux Tapestry in Normandy, and I watched the little film prior to looking at the tapestry, and it showed Edith Swan Neck, or at least you know, reenactment of Edith Swan Neck, of course, looking for her husband's body on the battlefield. Now, I knew very little about Edith Swan Neck at that time. I mean, I taught history, I taught the Norman Conquest, but I knew nothing about Edith Swan Neck. And of course, I became very interested in her. And I then started looking at the Waltham Chronicle in the Bodleian, and it's now online probably, but there I discovered my story, because that describes that incident of her looking for her husband's body on the battlefield. I think the story is all important, of course. I think that you have to have protagonists that readers will want to follow, they want to enjoy that story. But of course, I as a writer have to enjoy writing that story and have an affinity with that person. They want to see characters who actually grow, experience things, experience events, but grow as they do. So that keeps the pages turning, I think. But for me, the research is ongoing as I write, because readers also want that immersion in the historical world that your character inhabits, and for the whole of the book's duration. So you do need to know, and I also think you need to know where your story is going to end before you actually begin, even if you change the ending. I think it's good to have an idea of a possible ending for that story, because with historical fiction and with particularly marquee characters in historical fiction, I mean, they have huge timelines. So you've got to sort of cherry pick your events and cherry pick where your ending is going to be. So you've got to sort of like have the story. That's why the story is very important too. So it's both, it's research and story.
Brilliant, thank you, Carol. And Samantha, which
Yeah,
do you do first?
Well, I think Elizabeth and Carol have both said it really well. I think whenever I'm reading, I tend to stop and pause a lot and think about, maybe it's just somebody kind of mentioned on the side, but to think about what their life was like and what they experienced and how interesting their whole story would be to tell and to dig into. And so like they both said, you know, someone has to kind of pique my interest. And then from there, definitely the research, you know, I always start with a timeline of their life and then, you know, move on then to the part where I get to actually tie that all together with how it felt to actually go through those events.
Brilliant. Right, question number 2. What tools do you use? This one I'm really interested in, because I can't do this because I write non-fiction. So what tool do you use to aid the historical narrative? Do you use invented characters to help move things along? How do you see things? Like with me, I can do an overall view of what's going on, but you have to do it where it's your characters who are aware of things. So how do you make sure that you see the whole picture rather than just what your characters see? Do you use an invented character? Do you use a number of characters, sort of thing? So I think I'll ask Carol first this time.
Hi. Well, I do use invented characters alongside marquee personalities, and I use them to provide scope and to give me scope. That also does come into point of view as well. I mean, I've done both. I've done first person point of view. I've done with Elizabeth Cromwell, I did first person point of view. I've also done you know, various points of view, as I did in the Handfasted wife, and there I had an invented character called Padar, who was very important to that story about Edith Swan Neck. The problem at first was that Padar was taking over the story, and I had to actually manipulate it so that Padar did not have his point of view pushed forward when Edith was on stage. So when Edith was on stage or in a scene, you know, really I found it easier to do her point of view because Padar was such a strong character in my mind. So I invented a character who almost took that story away from poor Edith. I tend to research also the world I'm writing about very thoroughly. And I try to create scenes that will permit a reader with a portal into that world. I think that's very important. And again, I research as I write. I think that scene writing is very important. Hilary Mantel sees the novelists that create the narrative, which is true. You don't want to be telling. That's a difference with fiction and non-fiction, is that, you know, in fiction you don't tell, you dramatize really. I love social history, so I do tend to use an awful lot of online resources. I use museums, I visit locations when it's possible. For example, with The Betrothed Sister, which is going to be reprinted in September, thank goodness. I know Pierre very well. I speak some Russian as well. And so I do an awful lot of armchair traveling as well. And, you know, I use all these tools like evidence, sources, everything.
Rose, can you turn your... Oh, that's all right. Brilliant. Thank you, Carol. Samantha, next. What do you use? I know with Plantagenet Princess Tudor Queen, you used, it was first person, so it had to be everything Elizabeth saw, didn't it? Do you do that all the time? Was that harder to do?
You know, I don't know if it's harder to do. That is how I tend to write all of my books. And I always start out with a goal of just wanting the readers to really understand what it was like for that person to live through what they lived through. So they do tend to be more, like you said, in a single person's head rather than a big overview of historical events. And I think that's what attracted me to Catherine Donahue in Luminous. She was a real dial painter using radium paint in Ottawa, Illinois. So it's really her experience and her emotions that drive that story. And sometimes I've used a fictional character to, you know, maybe demonstrate something that's known about who I'm writing about, but I've not figured out a good way to bring it out. But a lot of my characters tend to be real people. And yeah, so it is just trying to get at their experience in a different time and place and use that to move the story along and help the reader experience what they experienced.
Brilliant, thank you. And Elizabeth, I know you tend to stick to, I'm trying to think if you use fictional characters in yours, or if they're all, most of them, the main characters are real.
These days, I mean, when I first began writing with novels like The Wild Hunt, all the characters were fictional. These days, they all tend to have existed, and even the secondary characters and thirdly characters will be actual people from history. I think so. I don't tend to use invent a character to advance the historical narrative. That's not generally part of what I do. But I do look at scenes in chronicles and see if I can move my characters into one of those scenes to report it. Matthew Paris was particularly good. He's sort of, or Gerald of Wales, were both really gossipy tabloid journalist types, and they will create scenes that you can think, I can put my character into that scene. You know, I will find fascinating incidents from the history that I can put my character into that incident if it's plausible that they were there. And you can create, you know, numerous scenes just from reading incidents in chronicles, and just widening it out a little bit, imagining your characters. If it's plausible that they were there or likely they were there, you can then write up that scene, I think. I suppose there's other little facts that you can add in just from your research, such as I remember finding out that the medievals believed that rock crystal was actually fossilized ice. And you can just bring that in as a little detail while they're having a discussion, and that's fun for the reader, because it's not what we know as you know, Bob moment where people are telling you all their official history, like, oh, you know, our son was born in 1233, and you know that's silly. But if you can bring in little details such as this fossilized ice thing, if somebody's looking at a you know, a dagger hilt or something, then that adds to the personalities. It adds material for the readers. And I think immersing yourself in the period by actually doing the reading in the background, you're not dumping it in the novel, but you know, so it becomes organic. The more research you've done, I think, the more truth you'll have in your imagination and your rendition of the finished article.
I think that's very true. The more research, the more authentic it all seems. Thank you, everyone. As a non-fiction, this is one of the ones that I really admire you all for, because as a non-fiction writer, when you get something where you don't know exactly what happened, you can present all the likely scenarios, and you can either put forward your argument as to what you think is the most likely, or you can even leave it up to the reader and just say, this is what might have happened, or this, or this. We simply don't know. So these are what or why it might have happened. But as a non-fiction writer, you can't exactly, as a fiction writer, you can't exactly put all the scenarios. You have to pick one. And I admire you all for that, because I don't think I could do it. I much prefer being able to put all the options. So how do you decide which scenario to go with? Is it the most likely? Is it the one that fits the story, that makes the story better, or sends it in the direction you want to go in? Which one do you go with? Samantha, you're up first this time.
All right. Well, that was one of the things with my more recent book, was so much easier because, as you said, Luminous takes place in the 1920s. So I had a plethora of newspaper articles and court transcripts and letters between the women, and so much to go on that I don't recall a time that I had to make a decision like that, but which is of course different writing about Elizabeth of York. And for some reason it had not struck me until I was already writing that I thought, I'm going to have to say somebody killed the princess in the tower. And no matter what you say, someone is not going to like what you decide to do with that. So, and in that case, that's the biggest decision like that I've had to make. And in that case, I will admit, I did go with what I thought was the most dramatically interesting, that made the best story, because there's people who are so fervently positive about, you know, multiple different theories regarding that I picked, in that case, picked the one that I thought made the best story. Is it the most historically likely? Probably not. But in that case, since there wasn't kind of a consensus on what was probably the answer, that is a time that I did pick story, I guess, over history. But it's really it's a mystery, right? So then you can kind of do what is interesting to you, and that's what I did. In general, though, yeah, I definitely try to follow what history says. I don't put somebody in a place that I know they weren't there. You know, I try to keep in mind that at least I am writing about real people, and so I wouldn't want somebody to write about me or one of my loved ones and say, oh, they did this if I didn't. So I try to treat my characters that way too.
Thank you. And what about you, Elizabeth? I know you did with Eleanor of Aquitaine. I was really surprised that you had her have that baby in the yes. Holy Land. So how do you decide which one to do?
Well, there I got complete carte blanche, because there's nothing. We don't know what happened in the Holy Land, and perhaps for all time what happened in the Holy Land stayed in the Holy Land. Generally speaking, what I do is look at the scenarios and ask myself, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is this to have happened? And if it's an 8 or above, I'll go with it. And if it's not, then I'll find a way round. And there is always a way round. You just have to work it out. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle. I think you've got another question coming up, which is to do with dates. So I'll save some for that. But generally speaking, is this plausible? Could it have happened? And you have to ask yourself those questions, yes or no, and then decide, you know, which way to go, really. But with writing historical fiction, you can, in the author's note, say, well, I had to decide between this and this, and I chose, this is why I chose this. If you so desire to do so, of course, you can put in why you chose a particular scenario. But that's my general rule of thumb. Is it likely? Yes, and that's also going on what research I've done, and also the social mores at the time. Because the more research you do, the more a better judgment call you can make on how likely something was to have happened, and then it's up to you, the writer, to make it as dramatic and interesting as you can.
Thank you. And how about you, Carol?
Well,
you and Elizabeth have both had
I go
to
with what they've said. I go with what they've said.
Yeah.
For me, it's weighing up the possibilities and going with the most likely. And the story's narrative does have to be consistent, whatever you choose. But I'll give you an example. For example, was Isabella of France sexually involved with Roger Mortimer? Nobody knows. There's no conclusive evidence. Any sources that suggest were written a while afterwards. So I struck a balance, and I teased with this one in the Stone Rose. Edward's possible survival is another point in the Stone Rose that's provided me with dramatic possibilities. Nobody knows, really. But there's a lot of conclusive evidence. A lot of historians now, I think you might agree, Sharon, are considering that he possibly did survive. He certainly was not killed with a red hot poker.
No, definitely not.
Of the posterior. But if someone wrote that and wrote it with beautiful writing, etc., because it's fiction and not biography, I could accept it. But I would like an author note there to say that why they chose that possibility and where that came from. I do think that a lot of readers take, their history from fiction, that they then maybe will go on and look further and research themselves a little bit further if they're very interested in the story. Here's another one. Did Eleanor of Castile suck poison from Edward's wound when he was attacked with a poisoned dagger in Acre? Now, in this, I did read widely, and I drew my own conclusions from that. And I read about women in the Crusades and all sorts of things before I decided how I was going to write that scene. But I think on the whole, it's best to stick with the most likely historical evidence and fill in the white spaces using the imagination. So I tend to be fairly conservative on the whole.
Thank you, Carol. Right, my next question is one that this actually comes up in the Historical Writers Forum Facebook group quite a bit, and with writers not quite sure how far they can go. So is there a line where the fiction should stop, or does anything go? How far away from the actual history can you go? Can you make a real historical person into a bad guy, even though there's no evidence to suggest it? Or can you make one who's always been believed to be a bad guy into a good guy? I'm thinking of Simon de Montfort with you, Elizabeth and Carol here.
Yes, we don't like him very much.
And Mary,
I don't anyway.
And Mary Tudor with Samantha, Queen Mary I. So how far, where is there a line? Elizabeth?
Well, that is completely down to your own integrity, I think. I wouldn't tell any other author of historical fiction what to do. It will just depend on the person. Myself, I think that there are many different interpretations when you study the historical sources. I heartily dislike Simon de Montfort, and I found that when you find, like when I've been writing in A Marriage of Lions, that nobody has written a biography of William de Valence, or that he's been given the really fuzzy end of the lolly, and his wife Joanna, and have been vilified by history. But when you actually look back in the history, there's no reason for it. And so as long as I'm looking at the historical sources and I can back up what I say with historical sources, even though I'm writing fiction, I feel that's good enough. I know another one is King John, of course. He gets mostly vilified, but there are people who are also think that he's been given the fuzzy end of the lolly, and you can argue either way. So that would be, it's up to the individual, but I think the individual should look at the historical details, research thoroughly, and decide why they are coming at them from that angle.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Be able to back it up, even though they're writing fiction. Yeah. That's my take.
So if anyone says to you, I think you're wrong, you can say, well, this is why I think
this is my opinion of why I'm not wrong. And you have your opinion. It's the same with Richard the Lionheart. Some of the discussions on some of the Facebook forums are astonishing. Yeah. When you challenge them, you know, it's quite a battle across the tennis court.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Carol, how about you? Is there a line?
You see, anyone can be a bad guy depending on the perspective. And people are not all good and they're not all bad. So it depends on how you want to tell the story. I mean, that's standing back from it. I agree about, you know, researching pretty thoroughly your characters. William of Normandy, for example, might be a bad guy for some, but of course he's going to be very good for others. And, you know, sources do exist indicating both viewpoints. William of Poitiers, for example, versus Edmure of Canterbury, you're going to get a completely different, you know, story. And those are first sources, primary sources. You always need to examine the provenance of a source. That's what I feel as well. If you're going to, you know, research your story quite thoroughly, because some sources are quite fabulous. I don't know if you ever come across Hayden White, Sharon, but Hayden White is somebody who examines sources and interrogates sources. He's written lots of books on it, and he writes a lot about, you know, different kinds of sources. Early sources like Herodotus are definitely fabulous sources, and some of the very early sources, Anglo-Saxon sources, perhaps as well. But again, it's viewpoint, isn't it? And where they're being written and how they're being written. So for me, again, it's filling in the white spaces between the facts. And I would personally, by the way, not change given facts. You know, opinion's a different thing, and that's where, you know, you get the opinion within those sources. For example, and this might be really treading onto Sam's territory, but was Anne Boleyn guilty of what she was accused of? I mean, if you examine that, and you can see that her treason might have been her being loose-mouthed at times, complaining about the king, thus ill-wishing the king, which was one of the accusations made against her. So it really does, you know, bad guys, good guys can be bad guys depending on whose perspective it is within your story.
Thank you, Carol. Samantha?
Yeah, I think that's a great point about, you know, different perspectives, and a lot of the people that we tend to think of as purely evil almost certainly weren't. Most people aren't purely good or purely evil, and that's one of the things that I really love exploring about historical figures. And I mean, I would say though that for me, I think absolutely there's a line in what you should write about someone who was a real person, just because, as I said before, I wouldn't want someone to put in action into my life or words into my mouth that they knew I didn't say. I mean, there's a big difference between making a call and deciding what's likely and completely making something up because you just want this person to be evil. So let's have them do this. I don't agree with doing that. But I do think that exploring their motivations, both good and bad, and the contradictions in their personalities, I mean, I think that's where the stories are.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, my next question is moving timelines. I know this is one that authors struggle with a lot. Is it acceptable, or how far is it acceptable to move historical events so that they fit in with the story? Or should the story fit around the specific dates like the Battle of Lewes or Magna Carta? Well, those ones, I suppose they have to be fixed. And maybe it's things like years when people married and things like that that could be more flexible because we're not totally certain, sort of thing. So, yeah, which way do they have to stay fixed? Carol?
Well, I tend to keep a historical timeline when I've researched, and I'm quite careful about that. I can place events in a different order. I did that in The Women in the Shadows. which was republished as Mistress Cromwell. I would use flashbacks into a particular point in the story. So I'm coming away from the timeline a little bit to do that. But I mean, they happen in that time. Mistress Cromwell, for example, is not a linear book, not completely linear. It's up to a point it's linear, but it comes back to Midsummer's Day in a particular year quite frequently throughout the book, and moves through her house during that time, or moves through her environment during that time. I think author notes can be very useful for this sort of thing, because timelines are not always, as you pointed out yourself, correct in the sources. We don't really know when some people were born. We don't know whenever they died, and certain events perhaps are recorded as being at a particular time in one source and maybe not quite so in another source. So I do tend to just make a historical timeline that I'm going to stick to and hope it's, true as far as possible.
Thank you, Carol. Samantha.
I agree with Carol. I think that I always start with a timeline. That's the first thing I always do. And I can think of one time where I had a minor character live an extra year because I had wanted them to be a part of a certain scene. And I did explain it in my author's note. And it wasn't a huge part of the story. So I think that readers are generally forgiving about that kind of thing. If it adds to the story and it is a minor change, I think that those are generally considered acceptable. I can only think of the one time that I did it, because I do think that a lot of people are reading historical fiction as their history. Mm-hmm. So I think we have some responsibility to be accurate, but I think that author's notes are great for explaining where you made little adjustments too.
I totally agree. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Right, no. If I find that if you read a chronicle or you read the general history and you find that a date isn't known, then that's fine. That's fair game. Somebody might have been born in the sort of a 3 or 4 year period, or even a 10-year period when they could have been born. So feel free to use that in your story. But if you've got a date that's generally fixed, and that could just be a minor date, never mind a major date like 1066, then no, because there's always a way around. You just have to find it. And that's part of, for me, the fun of writing. It's like having this big jigsaw puzzle, and you think, how am I going to work my way around this without warping the history out of true and without making the story boring? And it's finding that way through. And sometimes you have to puzzle it out, but it's always there. You've just got to get it out of your subconscious and onto the page. And as I said, well, fixed dates you can't. If suddenly I was writing about 9/11 and decided to move it to January or something, there'd be an uproar. And I feel that way. History is often thought of as you go further back, it's not as important. And that doesn't feel right to me because of my beloved Middle Ages. So if the chronicles can't tell you, fine, then use your own leeway. But if they do tell you, and they do tell you properly, then no, don't move it and find a way around.
Thank you very much. Right, speech in historical fiction. This is when I write non-fiction, so I don't have to worry about how characters speak to each other. But I know that in historical fiction, there is this thing where people wonder, how far do you have to go back in speech to be authentic, or to make it, or can you just speak as you do today and give them? I mean, basically, they were all in medieval times with Elizabeth and Carol. They were speaking French anyway. So you write the book. How do you make sure that the speech is understandable but at the same time authentic? Whose turn is it? Samantha.
All right.
So you're going to go with Luminous in 1920.
Well, that certainly has made it easier, and even anything in American history has made it easier to write about because there's a lot more documentation and it's in English. So yeah, that helps. You can look at how they spoke, what phrases they used, and it's much easier to write in any era, I think, in American history. The medieval history novels that I have, I'm actually more interested to hear what they have to say, because I'm not sure I'm an expert on it. I think that what I did and what I think a lot of people do is just use a more proper way of speaking than what we tend to in our everyday life. And we think, well, that sounds old-fashioned. So, I mean, and you can find, of course, phrases and words that they used too, but I think it's a little bit harder. And like you said, they weren't even generally speaking English, and certainly not the kind of English that we speak. So yeah, I'm interested to hear what Elizabeth and Carol say.
Yeah, because you did the Tudors as well, didn't you? So you should have gone full on Shakespeare, really.
Right, yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, I think, and I've got to paraphrase here because I don't remember the exact quote, but W.H. Auden said that your prose should have really no more effect on the reader or on the storytelling than looking through a clear glass window. So basically, you just write in plain English with perhaps just the odd twiddle, not a forsooth. Heaven forbid if any forsoothery creeps in. But you can add the occasional word perhaps, or just turn a sentence around. But for the most part, I think you should just use basic plain English. And I mean, some people go the whole hog and use modern swear words and modern phraseology, and that's fine because as writers as well, we are bridges between ourselves and the past by historical fiction, and readers are going to choose which bridge they want to cross, and the ones who want the modern language will find an author who writes in very modern language with modern idioms, swear words, etc., etc. Those who want the forsoothery will find the author with the forsoothery bridge. And then you find an author whose language speaks to you, and hopefully by using just plain English, you'll get a lot of people who you will speak to. But that's the idea. It's you've got an audience for each lot. I
think I read a Roman history novel recently set in Rome, and one of the characters said "okay," and he just sort of stood out because he's like, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't say "okay."
Yes, I'd read one not so long ago with an "okay" in it that was an early medieval, and I thought no, that's so, be careful. I mean, you can't go through an etymological dictionary looking up every word to see how old it was. It's got to sound right as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. Carol?
Well, Queen's English, definitely. And I have trouble with audio. I have trouble with the readers of my audiobooks, and I get put in touch with them because I had a fit about one book where this particular reader wanted to use these French accents. And to me, it sounded like hello, hello. So to put that back, I mean, I've made such a fuss about this, it's just not true. A smattering of odd words and speech patterns, perhaps on occasion, I think can work. I tend to avoid anachronisms, because some words will jump out and become too modern. And unless you're doing something like Susanna Dunn's doing, and she doesn't use swear words or anything like that, but she uses very modern language, or did whenever she was writing in her books. And she wrote some wonderful books, beautifully researched and beautifully written. But I couldn't be consistent with that, and it's not the way I write. But why make a book inaccessible? Unless you're going for something that's a literary experiment, for example, Hob. And, why mess around too much with the language? Because it's jolting. Because I want my readers to inhabit the world that I try to recreate. And I want them to follow a journey within that world. So I'll give you another example. Scott. I love Scott. I love Sir Walter Scott's books. I love his stories. But I skim over his use of dialect within them, which, is there. He's a Scottish writer. It's very authentic. But I can't bear it. So I read it very, very quickly because he overuses it. Whereas a modern writer of those stories might just put a little tiny snippet in just to give a flavour. I think it can spoil, you know, if you start messing too much with the language and go away from the Queen's English, it can spoil an otherwise fabulous story. So, you know, I don't do that.
Thank you, Carol.
I mean, I don't mess with the language.
Yeah. I think that's been really interesting. I've been really liked hearing that. So, what do you like best about writing historical fiction, and what don't you like, Elizabeth?
Right. Well, I like finding things out. So I suppose that is the research side. I like to delve and find something new that perhaps hasn't been looked at before, or perhaps looked at at a different angle, with a different spotlight, and that can be actually quite addictive. So that's a favorite thing to do. And also, you can, as you're writing, you can escape into the world of the historical fiction, which is very different to today's world. What don't I like? Well, one of the things is having to keep my word count down. I don't suppose that will affect, if you're doing self-published, you can have your word count as long as you like, but I'm contracted to have a certain word count with a bit of leeway, but not too much. And quite often I could do with a bit more space. So I suppose it's a good discipline for actually learning how to keep your work tight. The other thing I think is historical details. It's all, if you get something wrong, then the readers will write to you. So that's always a bit of an embarrassment. But there's also the thing where you get a reader who thinks they know it and they don't. I felt very sorry for, I think she must have been I don't think she was a British writer writing in America, but she mentioned cornfields in England, and she got this really quite vitriolic comment on Amazon. Sorry, my brain's going on Amazon, saying, well, of course they didn't have cornfields in England in the medieval period because it was a new world product. And I thought, well, here's a reader who knows about American corn, but hasn't got the first idea that they had, you know, cornfields at wheat fields in Britain in that time. And so this poor writer was getting pilloried for being historically accurate. So that's a bit of a bummer, because you can't again respond and go, oh yes, it was on Amazon, because you can't argue back and forth, because it's not a professional thing to do.
No, you don't.
It's a bit annoying.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's just like, I just want to tell you. Carol, what do you like best about it?
Well, I just love inhabiting the worlds that I'm creating. I just love getting into them. It's real escapism. I love investigating the places and the scenes and the characters for those worlds and the research, whether I'm writing imagined or real characters. I like to put myself in the character's shoes, but I still get surprises. So even though I plan my books quite well, I loosely plan them in a 3-act structure, but it's very fluid, and I do a lot of redrafting to keep it all fluid and consistent. At first, one of the things I didn't like was doing an awful lot of redrafting. I thought whenever I got my story down, I could just go through it a couple of times and that would be it. But actually now I really enjoy the redrafting process, because I think I get the structure tighter. I don't like this business about, keeping to a word length, but one has to. And or else the book could be too big and maybe not right for the sort of book that you're writing, if it's not meant to be too big. But there's not much I dislike about writing. I enjoy it all at the moment, thank goodness, touch wood.
Thank you, Carol. Samantha.
What I really love about writing historical fiction is just really digging into the mindset of different eras. I like to try to really understand the different ways that they thought about things that aren't the same way we think about them now. I like to explore that through their personality in the book and help my readers to try to understand that people haven't always thought the way that we think. And I do believe that some people struggle with that a little bit and don't like it sometimes. Like you said, I've written about Queen Mary, and people often just dismiss her as an evil villain because of the burnings of Protestants, which of course is an awful thing, but she's also a really great character to dig into. And, you know, why did she think that that was okay? What were her beliefs that she decided that was the best thing to do? That's what I really enjoy most about writing. And I would say what I don't like is having gaps and trying to decide how to fill them. I know we were talking one day about Isabel de Warenne, and I said I just got stuck when I didn't know when her kids were born, and how do I decide what to write then? And so it's, you know, still sitting off to the side. I haven't finished it. I have a hard time deciding what to do when we don't have that historical timeline, and I don't want to make something up that isn't right. So, I mean, generally there's not anything that I don't like, but I do struggle when I come across something where I have to make a decision like that.
Thank you very much. Right, last question from me is, what key piece of advice would you give to someone starting out on their writing or publishing journey? What is the best thing, most important thing you've learned in writing? Carol.
Well, it's finding a story in an era that you absolutely love. You might have to read around a little bit to find that, but you're going to be there for a long time, so you'd better like it.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
I think another piece of advice is research. Yes, research before you begin, but stop and create the story. And for me, it's researching as I go along, as well as the initial research I've done. I know my worlds reasonably well, and I think what Sam said about the mindset is so important. The different eras of different mindsets, and I would advise any writer of historical fiction to try and get a grip on the mindset. I mean, if you're writing medieval, get a grip on that. If you're writing Mary Tudor's period, get a grip on the Reformation and so on and so forth. Characters can often surprise, and you know, a writer coming to them could have lots of fun with those surprises. And you could have surprises as you write. For example, Elditha in The Handfasted Wife was supposed to marry somebody else, but I was flexible enough to go with what I felt, that in the end she followed a different path. I'm not going to say what it was because it might spoil the story for somebody who's not read that and is interested in reading it. I think get on with the writing. That's important, because you could research. Research is so fascinating. You could be researching forever, but get on with the writing. And you can tidy it up later. That's what I learned, even though I was resistant to that at first. Writing a first draft in a linear way is possibly easiest way to write it, rather than getting tempted to write chapter 8, because you've got an exciting idea for chapter 8 before chapter 3, because what you write in chapter 3 might affect a lot of things in chapter 8. So I think I would be inclined to advise writing in a more linear way to start off with. Don't get tempted to write chapter 8 before chapter 3. Reorganize it later. And don't fuss too much about perfection. Get to the story, get it down, and be disciplined. Set aside daily writing time. And again, do research as you write.
Thank you, Carol.
That's my advice.
Elizabeth.
Right. Well, what Carol said about do enough research to get yourself started and decide what your period is, because you've got to be passionate about it. But then, yes, research as you go along as well, because the first draft is basically that. It's like a pencil, a charcoal sketch. You're going to put in all the colours and detail later. So I'd say don't rush it as well, but be regular. Set yourself a target, so many words a day or a week, and stick to it. And make sure that it's a target that you can do, you can comfortably do, because that means then that you know, if you can do 500 words a day and you set yourself a target of say 400, then you're always going to hit your target and not get discouraged. So find a target that's very easily doable and write that number of words a day. Doesn't matter if it's rubbish, because as Carol says, you can tidy as you go along and edit. The other thing about not rushing, I would say, is that once you've finished it, edit it and edit again, or perhaps get readers, if you've got friends who like reading historical fiction, you know, to read it and give good commentary on it. Don't rush into self-publishing it the moment it's finished, because you may have done yourself a disservice. It's got to be the best it can ever be before it goes out onto Amazon and everywhere else, because otherwise you'll be pulling it back in a few months later and thinking, oh my goodness, did I really write that? So you've got to be sure about it. But I think the last piece of advice, though, is to have fun. Enjoy it. You know, it's not sitting there opening a vein, as some literary writer once said, oh, writing's easy, I sit here and open a vein. No, you've got to sit there and love what you're doing. It's going to be fun. You're going to want to be doing it. You know, it's so don't get hung up on it. Enjoy it and explore. You've got that draft to explore. What if this happens? What if that happens? So if you're just starting out, experiment. Oh, and finally, read. Because you will learn so much by osmosis. Absolutely. Read and read and read. Always have a book on the go. That's how I learned to write, by reading. Well,
Thank you. Samantha, any words of wisdom from you?
Well, I definitely agree with Elizabeth and Carol. That is all great advice. And the one thing I can think to add is to just join a network of writers, get connected with people like our Historical Writers Forum. It's just such a great resource. And I know that anytime I have a question, whether it's on research of any era or writing style or formatting my files or whatever it is, I know I can put a question out there and I'm going to have an answer pretty quickly. And a discussion, not even just one answer, but people saying, well, this is what I do, and this is, you know, these are some different places you can look. And it's just been so helpful to have friends who are writers, who are passionate about the same things I'm passionate about, because I don't know about you guys, but my family does not like history or writing as much as I do. I'm guessing that's a pretty common situation to be in. So yeah, I really love having my writer friends.
Smashing. Thank you, Samantha, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to, if anyone, feel free to turn your cameras on now, although if you'll keep your microphones muted until we get to the people actually asking questions. I'm going to go through the chat now and have a look at any questions on there and see if anyone wants to answer them. The first one's from Christy Nicholas. What are your favourite reliable sites for details on everyday life, like cost of items, meals, clothing, things like that? I'm guessing there's not just one site. Wouldn't that be handy? Who wants to answer? Just put a hand up. Carol, thank you.
Okay, I just said, I assume you're asking for ideas of books and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
I think that
our website.
I think that in Mortimer's Time Traveller's Guides are quite good, you know, to start off with. And another tip is that if you get a very good book, you know, for example, a biography of a character that you're writing about, look at the, you get other ideas, obviously, in the bibliography of that book to go and look further. So that with books, but I also think museums are great and reenactments are great. That's my contribution there.
Thank you, Carol. Elizabeth?
Well, it's a bit difficult because I don't know what period the question's being asked about or anything, but I would say that if you're trawling online and you happen to come across what you think is an interesting website, just bookmark it. I've got a whole row of bookmarks which I couldn't tell you what they are, but I've got them stored as bookmarks. I thought that's good, that's good, that's good. Click, 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 and then they're there for me to look at later at my leisure.
Yeah, I've got the same. I've got bookmarks within bookmarks as well, because I've got a Nicola de la Haye bookmark and all the things related to her under there. And same with the Warrens and things. It's like there's so many sites that it's impossible to narrow it down really, except for Oxford DMB, I think.
I've just seen I think an added question about whether these sources are reliable or not. Generally look to see if you want the really reliable stuff, if they're university accredited or come from museums and things. And if it's just sort of a random member of Joe Public who's putting it up, then you perhaps need to look at other sources in order to qualify it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Samantha, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would say is just old newspapers. And of course, I'm thinking about writing more recent eras, but I love looking through old newspapers and just seeing the ads that are in there, you know, what was for sale and how much it cost.
That's a really good idea. I hadn't thought of that, yeah. So you can see the prices and things. Oh, wouldn't that have been handy in medieval times?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You need to look at household accounts, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Household records, really, to get that kind of sense. But there is an awful lot online. I think I misinterpreted the question initially. You were asking about facts and saving facts and where to find them. I do think there's a lot online, but I would agree with Elizabeth that you do have to be careful and look at the provenance of what you're looking at, really.
Yeah, definitely. All right, next question is from Jolene. How and when do you build the story outline fitting in research, fictional characters and setting? So yeah, how do you build your fictional world? Who wants to go first? Samantha?
Sure. Yeah, I always start with, and I think Carol's already said this, that just with a historical timeline, I make a notebook of, you know, put everything in order, all the things that we know that happened, and then I just start looking at how to connect those things. What was the person I'm writing about? What was their part in that? How did they feel about that? And how, if I don't know how they got from one point to the next, you know, what makes sense and what were their motivations. So that would be how I fill it in.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, I really don't know how to answer this one, but what Samantha says, once I know who I'm going to be writing about, I will know my beginning, middle and end once I've read enough of the research material. The rest just comes as it comes. I'd like to say that I have a plan, but I don't particularly. I just it's just there. It's like having the subconscious is like a load of little gnomes in the background who just send it forward every now and then when they've finished it, and I go, right, that's how it goes. This is where the next scene starts. So I do write a synopsis at the beginning, which runs to about 16 pages. This is to submit to my publishers. I've also got detailed character studies. I also send in what they call it, screenshots of, not screenshots, photographs of artifacts from museums that might be connected with the characters and things. PowerPoint. I do a complete PowerPoint of the story of the novel with photographs and notes, and all these go up to my publisher. Plus, of course, a musical soundtrack, which is modern music, but it inspires me. And all these are going on in the background, but they come forward from you know, back of house. But that's I suppose a layout for starting.
Yeah, I must say, when I know I write non-fiction, but I tend to research until I get the idea of how the book's going to take shape. So I get that. Is once you've got the research, you sort of know it presents itself to you.
Yeah, it's like a map, almost of going from, I don't know, London to Edinburgh, and you know what the major points are going to be along the way, where the stops are. But you also know that there are going to be other stops, and there might even be a detour, and you don't know what the weather's going to be like or the scenery is going to be like until you're actually on the journey.
Thank you.
But you've got a route map of where you're going.
Well, mine's a bit of both. I mean, I tend to have a plan, but it's built. I kind of have a rough plan for the stories, an awful lot of characters, because it's very easy to make mistakes and so on. Once you get right deep into the story, you can forget, especially with the minor characters. So I do tend to have that. So I keep everything in notebooks. And then I start writing as I write.
Smashing. Thank you, Carol. Kate Pettigrew says, what happened in the Holy Land stayed in the Holy Land. Love it. I love that as well. I think that's brilliant. I hope I remember that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I've actually got a blog on William on my website called What Happens in the Holy Land Stays in the Holy Land, but it's about William Marshall. But same thing.
Oh yeah, because we don't know what he did in the Holy Land, do we? He just
which is more or less what he might have done, but yes.
Right, so this is from Sylvia, what do the authors do with the research notebooks once they've finished? I have to say, mine's about, I think it's about 2 feet high now, but I have to keep it because my books tend to follow on from each other, so I need to keep the old notebooks because I'll need them. That research is done for another book in the future. So what do you do with your notebooks, Elizabeth?
I've got a few. I've got some. They're just stashed in a cupboard, but I don't tend to take that many notes, to be honest. But I do have a few notebooks in the cupboard, but mostly I don't take notes. It's all my research notebook is my head, which is very odd. I know. I've inherited it from my dad. I think he was like that, and I sort of absorb facts. I say it's my brain is a bit like a dustbin with Velcro sides, and everything goes in and sticks to the sides of the dustbin. But no, honestly, I do. It's most of it's in my head, or I know which book to go to where I saw the reading. So I will just say, well, so and so, I need to know about so and so again, and I'll go to the research book. And I will have put little sticky notes in the books. You know, there's brightly coloured little sticky notes you can get. I've perhaps got books with sticky notes all over the place in them, but that's it. I don't really have that many research notebooks.
Carol?
I have about 3 for each book, and they're just like exercise books, to be honest. So they're not huge, but I do the sticky notes thing all the time in books that I've got. I don't think I've got any up there, but I do that all the time. And when I'm involved in the story, I don't have too much trouble knowing where to go to check my information or whatever, or, you know, check fact. But they're useful because perhaps later on you're going to come back, you're going to write something about that book, or you're going to revisit that book, or you're going to revisit another character that was in that book. I mean, I've got an idea that I might revisit the Handfasted Wife series again, and, you know, write about the child who was taken as hostage to Normandy, according to some of the chronicles. So I might do that. Now, those notebooks will be quite useful to look at when I do. But of course, I've got all the books. I've got masses of books, and at the moment, I'm writing a non-fiction about Harold's elder daughter, Githa Godwinson, or Godwin's daughter, who went and married. Who was a spectacular marriage was made for her with the Prince of Kiev, who eventually became the Grand Prince of Kiev. So having the notebooks that I used at the time when I was writing The Betrothed Sister, which was her story, are useful. Because I kept a lot of, I mean, for example, with that particular book, a lot of the research was from sources like the Russian Primary Chronicle, which I can only access. I can't access that online as far as I know. I can only access things like that by going to the Russian Studies Library in Oxford, the Slavonic Studies Library in Oxford, which I did originally. So I'm so glad I've got those notebooks. They're quite useful, but a lot of stuff stays in the head, yes.
Thank you. Samantha?
I do have my notebooks from my previous novels, but I will say that with my nonfiction book, that's the next one, and with the next novel I want to write, my husband, who's a technology guy, has convinced me to type all my notes, to keep all my notes in OneNote. So that's what I'm trying now. I'm trying to keep a digital notebook, and it's got all these little pages, and I'm getting used to it. But for everything else,
because I couldn't imagine doing that.
Yeah, for everything else, I have my old-fashioned notebooks. When the kids get done with school at the end of the year, I take their extra notebooks. It's nothing fancy, but I have them.
But if I can just jump in here, a lot of writers are using Scrivener as a place to just, when you were talking about your digital notebook, it made me think about how a lot of writers use Scrivener, because they use Scrivener, some of the facilities in Scrivener, to put their notes as they write for a particular book, and then they will always have access, presumably, to the Scrivener that they wrote that the Scrivener program that they wrote that particular book on.
Mm.
It's another way of compiling notes.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people use Scrivener. I've not actually seen it, but it sounds like Kathy's nodding her head. Do you use Scrivener, Kathy?
I've used it, and I'm not using it again. I nearly lost a whole section of the Damask Rose through trying to use Scrivener on a PC, and that's how I know about how you do the note facility and all of that sort of thing on it, although I kept my notebooks. But I fortunately was transferring into Word just in case as I finished a chapter. So it wasn't too disastrous, but you know, it could be for me.
Okay, Catherine asked, actually, I know the answer to this one for Elizabeth and Carol at least. So, do you ever go out of your way to live through the experiences that your characters went through? Example would be dressing like the time frame or doing the job they've done. So, who wants to go first?
I think Elizabeth.
Go on then, Samantha.
So when I was researching Catherine Donahue, one of the things that I found most interesting about her is that the town of Ottawa, Illinois is only a couple hours away from me. So I did go there and I spent a few days. I went to church where she went to church. I went hiking at the state park where her and her friends would hang out, and I drove by the house she lived in. So it was really neat to be able to do that. And that was the only book that I've written where I could do that. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing that. And I do feel like it made a difference in writing about her too.
Thank you. Carol?
Well, you know about my stone carving experience, that was wonderful. It not only made me understand the process of stone carving. I only had a day of it. I would love to go back and do more. But it got me very interested in reading about stone carving. So it helped in that way too. And although I haven't participated in reenactments, I love going to them. And I do think it gives you a sense of, of how people did things, crafts and other sorts of things. And museums. I mean, I absolutely loved, inspired me writing The Silken Rose was the embroidery that I went to look at in the Anglicanum. I went to look at in the British Museum. I mean, that embroidery, actually seeing those pieces of embroidery was stunning, and then reading more about them afterwards. So it does enhance if you can do some hands-on stuff or see stuff very close up from the past, and even the atmospheres of places from the past. For example, there's a wood very near us in England, in Oxfordshire, which was a hunting territory for some of the medieval kings. And at one point that wood came into the possession of Eleanor of Castile. So during the lockdown, the first lockdown, we took lots of walks. It was only a few miles from us. We took lots of walks through that wood, and I felt it did feel like a very old wood. There's no doubt about it, that particular one. And so all of those sorts of things are inspiring.
Brilliant, thank you. Elizabeth, I know you're in regular.
I was in regular Anglorum. I gave it up when my parents became ill and I had to spend more time with them. So I'm currently not a member, but that's not to say I won't rejoin. but I was a member of Early Reenactment Society Regular Anglorum for getting on for 20 years. And so, you know, here, one medieval shoe crafted by Ivor Lawton, who made makes museum worthy replicas. He was hired by Sutton Hoo to do one of their replica helmets. I have a sword and a helmet about somewhere that were crafted by him. Knife, all that sort of stuff. So you get that hands-on feel for those things. You know, you're feeling it, and then you're putting that feel into the novels. I've got a medieval cooking pot, 11th century Norman cooking pot, that I've experimented with, and find you can leave it on the fire, flipping away at the side of the fire, doesn't stick on the bottom. The rim is cool enough to pick up. You couldn't get any out of this, just even from looking in a museum. You cannot get that living history of experience of how a parliamentary farmhouse pottery cooking pot would work. So also, I mean, I didn't fight with Regular Anglorum, but I talked to the guys who did, and I got to put on their mail shirts and things. And
they're very heavy.
It was, well, not too bad. You got used to them after a bit. If you're a guy fighting in the armour, you get used to it after a while. So got to try on the armour, talk to the guys about the fighting, even ask them, what would you do in this situation if this was happening? And you get the full skinny from guys who actually do it. And so it adds dimension and texture. And also like things like the smells of the cooking fire. You know, everybody's clothes would have stunk of smoke when they were, by the time they'd spent the day over the cauldron. So all that is elements that you can put into a novel and increase that touch, taste, feel sense of being there.
Margaret asks, she's always interested to know in how people in medieval times were like or unlike us. I think that's a big one, isn't it, where we try and work out, because we tend to put modern values on medieval people, but were there bits where they were very like us and where they were totally opposite? Who wants to go first? Carol, go on then, Carol.
Well, okay. We do tend, it is difficult because we do tend to put modern values, and I think that is a very important part of research, is the way they thought, particularly in medieval times with the church, at probably Tudor times as well, and all times really, but particularly in medieval times when the Catholic Church dominated people's lives. And when you're writing about women, you need to understand that women were Eves, really. But what's really lovely is knowing all the rules, the societal rules, and then, you know, having a character break them, but you need to know the consequences and how they escape from the consequences and how they avoid them. I mean, that can make the fiction very exciting. For example, and Elizabeth does this, I'm sure, in fact, I know she does, where a woman, when a man goes off fighting or he goes off to the Crusades, and the woman is left as in charge of the castle, and all these powerful qualities come out. And of course, women have their own power, their own soft power very often. But you need to know all that. And then you will see that they are different, because people do have similar emotions to what we have. There's jealousy, there's anger. I mean, you go right back to Greek myths, you find it. Love, heartbreak, death, sorrow. And people, the societal rules will perhaps to some extent guide as to how people will process their emotions, but there will always be those emotions, particularly love emotions. And I read your little article on Joan of Fair Maid of Kent today, and she's a very good example of a 12-year-old. I think she was 12 actually, because I'm sort of researching her a bit at the moment. A 12-year-old who goes off and decides to get married to this handsome Thomas Holland, was it? Yeah. Thomas Holland.
Who then goes off on crusade and leaves them.
Who then goes off on the Lithuanian crusade with the Teutonic Knights, and then she can't. She's a very good example, because she can't really resist the pressure whenever she's 14 or 15 put onto her by her mother and by the king and by whoever else wants her to marry the Earl of Salisbury, was it?
Yeah.
The Earl of Salisbury.
Montague,
Yeah.
the Earl of Salisbury.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's all the shenanigans about Montague, about Thomas Holland coming back and so on and so forth, reclaiming her. And I mean, it's a wonderful story. I have to write it. I really love the story. It's my latest favorite, but it's a very good example of you know, emotions and how emotions can dictate behavior no matter what the societal rules are. But of course, in a village, in village life with ordinary people, it could be very, very difficult because you've got the lord of the manor, who might be a kind lord or a nasty lord, or you've got you know, pressure from the village and the village gossips and so on and so forth. I mean, whichever way, whichever part of society, there are rules that when the emotions start coming into play, certain emotions, they can be very interesting to see how you play that out in fiction.
Yeah, I also think it's a public and private thing, because everybody, you know, because I do about medieval women, and I always get the question, what do you think were these totally unique women who actually fought? And I think women may have been a lot more submissive in public than they were in private. And I think I can't imagine me 700 years ago not telling my husband when he was wrong. I might wait until we got home, but he'd still get told. So I think there are some parts of personalities where I think that we still did it. We just had to find different ways of doing it as women.
Yes, you do. You do, absolutely. You know, that's so true. Someone else.
It's I remember reading in a research book. It was a 13th century quote, and I know there are similarities and differences, but this always made me laugh. And it was a monk talking about children, and he said, I have never liked children. He said, the babies keep the parents up all night by squawking. Like junior school age children, he didn't say junior school, but that was the age group he was talking about. Like the 8-year-olds would always be running off while playing and running into the street and running under carts, and you had to have your eyes in the back of your head and drag them back from being run over. And the older ones, the teenagers, you have to keep going and keep asking you for money and going to the tavern. And I thought, well, just what goes around comes around. We still have screaming babies. We still have 8-year-olds, well, if they're not at the computers, getting into mischief, and you still have the bolshy teenagers, and this is still going on. So I love those similarities. I often sort of think of the past as being a bit like sort of a long road with bus stops along, and you can still sort of go like this and go around and see the medieval people standing at the bus stop further up. There are differences between us, quite often of society and technology, of course, but generally we're the same animal with the same drives. And I think sometimes as novelists we get to have a look at the motivations and behind those lives, and look at reasons for them as well. And also, there are slight differences. We would be horrified at the thought of a 12 or 13-year-old girl getting married today. That was the age of consent. The boy's age of consent was 14. But when you look at the medieval mindset, okay, the girl might have been horrified, or the boy. That's one choice you could make. But there could be tremendous pride in the family. I'm doing this for my family, and I'm proud to do this for my family. And these days, you know, you wouldn't necessarily think of that as an aspect of it. I think with the nobility as well, this isn't going off the subject of marriage, but just to say that they had servants around them all the time and accompanying them, and getting away to have a quiet word somewhere. As a novelist, it's quite often the thing of, how do I get this person away from all their entourage to have a chat with somebody? You know, even in their bedroom, they've got the servants all around them. And so you have to sort of think of ways of how would they do it. And some of the time would the servants, you know, have their ears to it and just know they had to say nothing. So there's all sorts of interesting premises and going on.
Thank you. Samantha.
I think there's a lot of timeless elements about the human experience that is what makes us interested in history and connects us to whatever era we're writing about, reading about, and that's what draws us to these characters, is what we do have in common with them, despite maybe hundreds of years. But I also think that digging into their mindset, and we think about what we disagree with that they did, and tend to think that how much things have progressed. One of the things I like to think about when I'm looking at that is, well, what would they have thought of us? What parts of our society would they be horrified by? And kind of turn that around. And there are similarities for sure, but I also like to try think of our society from their point of view, because I think that they might have some thoughts about us also.
Yeah.
I think they might have found our society very smelly, actually. They might not have liked the smells, the sort of chemical smells we have around.
Yeah, right. Good point.
We joke about medieval times and how unclean possibly people were and so on, which is not exactly true at all. They were much cleaner than you would think. And I think that they might have been quite shocked to come into our times.
Yeah.
They might wonder what we're doing, washing ourselves all over every day, whereas they might just wash certain parts of themselves.
Right.
If at all.
Thank you. I just saw a question and I can't find it now, but I remember what it was. I was going to say who asked it, but I can't find it. Who are your influences? Who do you like to read? Who are the authors who have inspired you?
Ooh.
Elizabeth?
I would say, but this is going back to when, in my early career, I suppose, and before I was published, the authors, I can quite clearly name them. I mean, Mary Stewart with The Crystal Cave sort of brought me onto the historical fiction line, if you like. I don't know how you pronounce her name, whether it's a soft G or a hard G, but I'll do a hard G, Roberta Gellis, who wrote medieval romance, really, but realistic medieval romance. And she showed me that you could write medieval romance that wasn't full of twitty-twattery, was full of absolutely realistic people, absolutely living in their time, and still have that romantic element. And then there was Sharon K. Penman, of course, with The Sun in Splendour and Here Be Dragons. She showed me you could write about real people and have that romantic element too. And the late great Dorothy Dunnett, who was absolutely in a league of her own. It took me, I think, 3 attempts to get into her, but when I did, it was like opening a door into this lush secret garden, and I absolutely loved her use of language. So Dunnett was inspiration. From the male aspect, I think, the surname, I can't remember his first name now, was Shelby, Graham Shelby, The Knights of Dark Renown, which was about the crusading period. And there was also George Shipway, who was quite visceral in his tellings. Night in Anarchy, about Civil War, Stephen and Matilda period. And then there was Cecilia Holland. I loved her novel Until the Sun Falls, which was about set in the dying days of the Mongol Empire. And she had a 50-year-old Mongol warrior called Psin as her protagonist. And I absolutely fell for him. I thought he was wonderful. So if her ability to do that and take me into another time and culture was just magnificent. I loved her novels Hammer for Princes and Great Maria as well, which were about the medieval period. Great Maria is set in about the Normans in medieval Sicily, and has an absolutely wonderful sex scene in a hay shed, which sort of led me to think that, well, no, it doesn't all have to be roses and leafy bowers. It can be right on the moment and a passionate couple in the straw. So I learned a lot of lessons from reading those writers. They're still favorites now.
Brilliant, thank you. Samantha?
I think when it comes to historical fiction, obviously Sharon K. Penman, again, she was one who I think a lot of us looked up to. And I also, C.J. Sansom, his Tudor series, Shard Lake series. I love Matthew. I love the way that you just feel a part of that world. You like you're Matthew's friend, not like you're reading his story. So I love his writing. And when I think about how I like to really write about people's emotions in my stories, I think that influence is more like from classic writers, though, like Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, that kind of writing, I think, is more what I think about when I think about that emotional element.
Thank you. Carol?
Well, whenever I was a teenager, I absolutely loved Jean Plaidy. I read all those things that we read, and I certainly loved Anya Seton's books. There's a load of others of that generation of writers that just can't think of their names right at this minute. But I agree about C.J. Sansom. I've read all of his books. I think they're beautifully written. There's just so many. I just read widely. I just read everything, I think.
I know that feeling. It's funny actually. One thing I've noticed, about 20 years ago, I was rereading books because there wasn't anything new coming out that I wanted to read. And now I don't even have time to read the books I've got. There seems to have been an explosion in the number of books being released these days.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
True. There's just so many.
It's just I wish they'd put another 12 hours in every day so I can read them all. Right, I think, unless I've missed any, I think that's all the questions off of the chat. Did you notice any other ones, Paula? No? Microphone on, bottom left.
Did you get the one about from Margaret Waller, I think, or Weller? Curious to know which sources you accept and which you take with a pinch of salt.
Oh yes, yeah. How do you decide what gravity to give to which sources, sort of thing? Elizabeth.
Well, it will generally come from university presses first, I think. If somebody's got an accreditation, then that I will go with, but also I will read around and make sure that I've got several different opinions on it, and that's better. And I'll talk to friends who are knowledgeable, because as you go along on the online community, you find people who know stuff about things, and you can run it past them. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And you get into perhaps an academic discussion with them. And So
if they don't know, they know somebody who does, which is brilliant.
Yeah, that's generally. I remember once asking a chap from Regia Anglorum, this was, who'd specialised in medieval, early medieval burial practices, and I was asking him about coffins. I said, "Can you tell me what about 11th century coffins?" And he said, "Do you want pre-1066 or post-1066?"
Right, he knew the difference.
So there was some, I can't remember what the difference was, but he could narrow it down to the decade. So yeah, you also, after a while, you get what I call is an inbuilt crap detector, and that's just from experience. And you can go, no for that. You might find errors in like a popular historical biography, and that you'll go, I perhaps won't read that person. Taking the face value. I think this one on Eleanor of Aquitaine, Amy Kelly and the Four Kings, which is absolutely beautifully written, but the whole Courts of Love thing has been debunked now, and there's newer research that I would go to rather than, for example, that book.
Thank you, Carol.
I think it's the internal sense of you know, what is authentic, a good book. I tend to know, I think on the whole. I was very interested in what Elizabeth was just saying there about the courts of love, because I've written about those several times, and well, I'd quite like to read that paper. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is just a sense of things, and things that have been recommended. Books that I know and writers that I know are quite good, but I think it's always very good to try and get to primary sources if you can, and look at a variety of those as well as secondary ones.
Yeah,
like,
and
for
remember
example,
what side they're on. Sometimes I've just done a book about the anarchy, and
yeah,
it's like you have to, with that, it is literally they're on the Empress's side or Stephen's side.
That's what I was trying to say about,
don't get an unbiased view. So it's like working out who do they praise most is who probably paid for them to write, sort of thing.
Yeah, what is the provenance? You've always got to look at the provenance of these sources, but yes, I mean, various point of views are very interesting for us as fiction writers, because, you know, you want to look at, depends what angle you're coming at or what angle a particular character is coming at. So it is very good to look at a variety of sources. Yeah, I also look at reviews of books. I mean, if it's a secondary source, a book that's been written recently, I look at a review of them. I usually know if Elizabeth's read it, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I like it. I like Elizabeth's bibliography at the end, because it's like, all right, oh, she used this book. Okay, Amazon, have you got it? I have got one of my books that I used extensively for Defenders of the Norman Crown was a recommendation from Elizabeth, which is the Farrer and Clay book about the honour of Conisbrough.
Oh yes, yes.
From Early Yorkshire Charters, Volume 8. It's like, that's like my Bible.
I've forgotten where I got that one. Noticed that one. Somebody else probably recommended it to me.
But it's so useful, and it's such because it's the Charters, it does give a glimpse into the family life, and that is brilliant.
That goat herd thing. It may have been a deer herd, because I've since discovered that, apologies to everyone for hijacking a minute, that the cappy whatever he was that he called his goat in Latin is also the same as a roe deer. So he may have been a deer herd.
Yeah, and they did actually have a deer park.
Yes, so he would be slightly a bit more upranked than a goat herd, but I've only found that out fairly recently.
Yeah, because I'm going to rewrite the book now.
Yes. Right, apologies for that, folks. Yeah.
But that's the other thing about sources. It is constantly changing, and you do have to keep doing your research. And once you've written the book, you've just got to let it go until you can edit it for the paperback sort of thing.
Yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Samantha.
So funny thing, when I was working on my endnotes for my nonfiction book that I'm writing, my husband made a comment about that. It seems like so much work for a part of the book that nobody looks at. And I said, well, I look at them, you know. So that's what I would say about, you know, evaluating a source. You know, casual readers might not look at endnotes or look at where something came from if you're, you know, just reading something for leisure. But when you're reading something for research, I'm always looking at the endnotes, looking at where somebody got something, and then, you know, that might lead me to go get that source. And because I do think you need a blend of primary sources and, you know, later research, because as you know, Sharon, sometimes you discover new things that maybe aren't included in those primary sources.
Well, it's also the perspective of time. It's time, you know, the distance of time, the perspective of time is enlightening. So it absolutely is a mixture of both.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need the secondary sources because you can't translate the Latin.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fun.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was all the questions from the chat. Has anybody else got any questions?
There was one, I saw one from Francis asking about what people think about writing in the present tense.
All right.
Oh, I love present tense writing. I have done it a bit. Yes, I have done it a bit in the Stone Rose for the stonemason. I actually, and I've done it in a book that I've not had published, or I mean, I need to revisit that book. It's an Edwardian story. I love it because I love the immediacy of it, and I love reading present tense books. I don't even notice it once I just get into it. It just feels more immediate. I forget that it's written in any particular tense if it's a good book.
Samantha?
Yeah, I think Carol's right. I love to read it. I've never tried to write it, so that would be interesting.
Oh,
but I
it
love
is.
to.
You've got to be very consistent. You've got to be very careful. It's hard.
Right.
But
Yeah,
Very hard.
yeah.
Sorry.
Elizabeth?
If I read it, then my mind automatically translates it into third. I do read it. I enjoy reading it, but it doesn't stick. If you ask me afterwards what tense was that in, I'll probably say third, which is weird. I write in present tense my very rough sketches, and then they go into third when they actually go into the novel. But I don't mind. I read both. I know some readers don't like it, but some do. It's it's a personal choice thing. So I've no wisdom to impart on whether it's better or not. It's your choice.
Anybody from the audience actually got any questions that they just want to ask? If you just want to wave sort of thing. And are you messing your hair, Paula, or are you waving? Ron, if you just put your microphone on at the bottom. And
yeah, hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, fabulous. One novel that I have in my mind is kind of based on an artist who was temporarily a roommate of Mark Twain. And I'm really intimidated about actually getting into that novel because I'm afraid of Mark Twain experts. I'm no Mark Twain expert, but I'm afraid of writing the wrong thing. Have any of you encountered that? And if you have, how do you overcome it? Because there's a lot of Mark Twain to read up on, and I don't want to be, an expert on him.
I think you just have to get the main points, really, the main points of his life, and make a timeline. And then as you come to it, just get started. And then as you come to certain aspects that you're not going to write everything. If it's a novel, you're going to cherry pick. And that's why I think that you cherry pick the bits that are interesting. And if you're putting it into a story, into a novel rather than a biography, it is a story. Is it?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. If it's a story, then I think you've got to think about, you don't need to know everything about Mark Twain, every single thing, to know what you'd like that story to be. And the story does have to have tensions, it does have to have jeopardy, it does have to have, it doesn't have to be highly dramatic jeopardy, it could be just psychological jeopardy, but you do have to have little turning points. But I think that you just need to cherry pick what you think is interesting and what will fit into a story. But to find the story first, you do need to read a bit about Mark Twain, obviously. Which you presumably have done quite a lot, I would have thought.
Yeah, fortunately, there was a short time period of just about, it was when Mark Twain was living in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. So there's just 2 points in time. That's about 2 years, really. So,
well, Mark Twain did say the coldest winter he ever experienced was summer in San Francisco. And having lived in San Francisco myself, I would agree. But yes, and I think you will find stuff. You will find a story. He was a journalist. He's a very interesting character. I think very good luck with that book, because I think it could be a great book.
Thanks.
I think you just need the need to know. What does your reader need to know in order for you to tell the story? No more, no less. That's it, I think. So that's what I'd say. What's the bottom line of the need to know?
I guess I'm just so intimidated because he's such a big character and he's fun as well too. I wanted to bring the element of him in there, but he's so witty. I wanted to be sure that I captured those elements of those times when he is in there.
But you'll get, from your reading, you'll get some of his witty sayings, so you can manipulate those into your story. So you don't need to dream it up,
Right.
that bit.
Thanks.
While you've got it just in your room with you, you can have fun with it as well and play with it. I know you might have the dilemma as you come to publish, but you know, just, you know, enjoy it while you're working on it.
Thanks.
Brilliant advice. Samantha, anything else to add? Or?
I don't know if I have anything to add. I can see why it's intimidating. I wrote about Reginald Pole, and just a novella, so it's not a full-length novel, but he had a lot of famous friends, people like Michelangelo. So it was fun to include those people, but it also was a little intimidating, like you said. And I think I tried to just kind of pick one element of people like that to include in Reginald's story, because I mean, it was Reginald's story actually anyway, but it was fun to add some of that in too, and just not put too much emphasis on those other people though. So then if you're focusing on, say, one part of Mark Twain or his interaction with your character, yeah, I mean, I think that could work really well.
Brilliant, thank you. Anybody else got any questions? I'm looking at the time and thinking we're probably all ready for a break. So if there are no more questions, no, I can't see anybody saying anything. So Paula, did you have a question? Because
I haven't got a question. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. It was a brilliant
Thank
couple
you,
of hours.
for having us, and Sharon.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. Thank you very much, Samantha, Elizabeth and Carol. It has been an absolutely fabulous evening. Thanks so much for taking your time to come to this. Thank you for everybody who joined us as well. We had over 40 people at one stage, and I've really enjoyed it, and really this was brilliant. This was our first one, and I don't think we've done too bad at all. I have recorded it, so I am hoping that I will get this online on YouTube over the next week, once I work out exactly how to do it and convert it to an MP4 and things. So look out for it.
Don't forget to join us. Don't forget to join us at Facebook and on the Historical Writers Forum. If you're not a member, please do join.
And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, because it's been such a lovely, what a way to spend a Saturday evening.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yes, we'll see you around online.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Right.